Chapter 4 The Carline Canopy, in which an unexpected reacquaintance is made. The next half a bell passed in uncomfortable silence as the wagon's journey continued at a much more wary pace. The Ixal ambush had put them on edge, despite the forest beauty being put on glorious display, shafts of midday sunlight cutting through the canopy above. The steady clacking of wagon wheels on the cobblestone seemed to drown out the rest of the world. Everything seemed so terribly vulnerable, like at any given moment another arrow would come whistling from the woods. Only as the forest gave way to clearing, and a great sparkling blue lake began to come into view, did Bremont or any of the passengers begin to relax. From a distance, it seemed like great misshapen trees lay ahead, with distant figures milling about them. As the carriage drew closer, the great palisade wall gained form, and beyond it, a great water wheel, far larger than any of its ilk. Yen stared at it, transfixed, as a hazy memory resurfaced in her mind. She knew she had been to Gridania once before, at a very young age, but had long forgotten the visit since. Seeing the mill again felt like meeting an old friend. Despite herself, she couldn't help but smile. Bremont gently pulled back on the reins, and with a chirp, the draft chocobos came to a halt. "All right, ladies and gentlefolk, this is our stop," he called cheerfully. "Gridania, sacred city of the forest." "I wonder who awarded them that moniker," the boy mused wryly. He got to his feet, turning to look at the girl next to him. Before he could offer a hand, she hopped to her feet herself. "Someone sacred, I'd hope," she murmured, rolling her eyes. She bent down and retrieved the traveling bag nearly as large as her, but with seeming effortlessness swung it over her shoulder. The boy, unburdened, did a half-bow to Bremont and Yen. "Thank you," he said with what seemed to be a mostly genuine smile on his face. The ride and companionship was interesting. "May we meet again?" Yen smiled weakly back, but didn't say a word. Frankly, she hoped she wouldn't see him for a long, long time. She got to her own feet before her politeness eroded, and picked up her own baggage. Bremont was content to simply watch proceedings in silence, at least for the moment. The second Yen's boots hit the ground, the old world began to reassert itself. There were woodwhalers everywhere, monitoring events at the gate unflinchingly. The carriage had arrived at a moment where no others were attempting to gain entry, leaving the three passengers as the sole focus of their attention. One by one, they were called forwards to be checked. Yen was far from surprised by her being last. As the two Ellison children disappeared beyond the gate, all eyes turned to Yennefer and her spear. She could see the disapproval in every whaler's face, and watched as many pairs of hands ilmed closer to weapons. The head guard was an Ellison, and he towered over Yen. She could barely make out anything else about him, other than he had pale skin and had dyed his hair a mossy green to match his armor. "State your name and place of origin," the guard said humorlessly. "Yennefer Fall. I'm from Quarrymill." She took steady breaths, in through her nose, out through her mouth. "Gridanian, traveler, or refugee?" The question was suffocating in its options, and demeaning in its tone. Yen knew the first choice was out, but which of the other two was right? Traveler?" she replied, uncertain. The guard raised an eyebrow. "From where, then?" he asked, with a sly edge in his voice. "Olda? Limsa? Yen blanched as she realized her mistake. "Oh, then, refugee," she stammered from the kick of nervous energy. I'm sorry. I misunderstood." The woodwhaler rolled his eyes. "I see." His tone was flat. After a short pause, probably spent deliberating if he should just turn her away now, he continued. "What is your purpose in Gridania?" Yen steeled herself for the worst, clenching her fists and forcing her arms to her side as tightly as she could. "I am here to apply for membership with the Lancers Guild." She closed her eyes, waiting for the inevitable no. When a moment passed, and none came, Yen forced herself to stop clenching her eyelids shut. The patrolman had moved a few paces back, and was craning half his body into a guard post embedded into the palisade wall. He had a sour look on his face when he returned. "You are permitted to enter," he said, sounding defeated. "Welcome to Gridania." Yennefer blinked, not fully processing what the guard had just said. When the words finally processed themselves in her mind, her heart skipped a beat. A cold rush of surprise ran up and down her body, like a strong breeze had just caught her. She stuttered, stunned. "Thank you." She briskly walked past him, afraid that if she lingered any longer, the man would change his mind. The gate swung open at her approach, a guard on the other side pushing it forward. They had only moved it a crack, but Yen was too elated to be annoyed. She slipped through with a smile, and all but skipped down the road beyond. She had made it. Before she had left, Yen had made a very brief list of things to do when, or if, as it had felt then, she arrived. She had chewed through most of her money just to get here, but there was, hopefully, enough gil in her coin purse to find lodging. Fortunately, Gridania's largest inn, the Carline Canopy, was also the home of the local Adventurers Guild. Yen hadn't come to the city to be an adventurer, but her bet was that she could still pick up a thing or two from those who had. Assuming, of course, that anyone would give her the time of day. Built into the same massive structure as the Grey Water Wheel, the Carline Canopy lived up to its name. The moment Yen stepped inside, she was dumbstruck by how cavernous the inn was. The ceiling was easily 30 or 40 feet above, the wood construction somewhat absorbing the din of the tavern-goers below, dampening any echo. The room was a collage of life, colors of all shades filling it. There were Gridanian browns and greens, yes, but also Oldant golds and Limson reds, and dozens of other hues that represented no other than the soul wearing it. Coming from quiet, stagnant quarry mill, Yen was immediately in love with the place so wonderfully vivacious. A small queue had formed on the far side of the inn, composed of a gaggle of mostly armored, all armed, would-be heroes. If anything told her where the Adventurers Guild actually was, nothing short of the heavens parting and a beam of divine light streaming down could have been less subtle. With a determined half-smile on her lips, Yen gently picked her way through the crowd to reach the line. It took her no small amount of time to get there, but the queue seemed to always remain full despite how quickly adventurers were exiting it. Yen wasn't sure if that meant being an adventurer made a lot of gil, or if it meant the average Gridanian made very little. Once she had made it in line, its surprising speed worked to Yen's advantage. It was not very long at all before it was Yen's turn to stand across a bar top from a middle-aged Elysian woman with a tired but cheery look on her face. She, too, was taller than Yen by several ilm, and her dark, shortly cut hair was a deep silver in shade. Despite how much she sagged in her stance, exhausted, the woman's smile was no less warm. "Welcome to the Carline Canopy," she began, "and welcome to the Gridanian Adventurers Guild." She gestured with a nod of her head towards the spear still strapped across Yennefer's back. "I trust the latter service is of more use to you?" Yen smiled, slightly embarrassed by the directness of the question, and scratched at the back of her neck without thinking. "Well, yeah, but I also need a room, too." "Fortunately, we provide those." The woman gently bowed her head in a how-do-you-do. "My name is Mion, but most people around here call me Mother. I own the canopy." Mion laid her hand on a ratty old guest book in front of her, already turned to face Yen. A quill rested in an inkwell nearby. "If you can write your own name, please do so. Let me know if you cannot, and..." A stern look crossed Mion's face, her eyes narrowing. "Do not write one of those ever-so-charming joke names. There is a very special hell for people who do that, and I would be full glad to drag you there." I see." Yen could feel herself pale slightly at the threat. Somewhere in that motherly visage was a killer's eyes, of that she had no doubt. Timidly, Yen took up the pen and started to spell out her own name. She hadn't been taught to read or write, not properly, but she could do that much at least. The moment she put the quill back, Mion's hands snapped to the register, the innkeep eyeing Yen suspiciously as she turned about to read. After a moment, Mion's head shot back up, a look of earnest, happy surprise on her face. "You wouldn't happen to be Ebba Fall's daughter, would you?" The moment Mion invoked the name, Yen froze. A cold hand reached into her chest and squeezed Yen's heart. Slowly, Yen nodded yes. Mion studied Yennefer's face carefully before wincing and closing her eyes. Her hands bracing herself against the bar top, Mion let out a long sigh. I am so sorry, Yennefer, she said, her eyes still shut. Thank you. Yen folded her arms over her chest, unable to stay warm despite the afternoon's heat. She died 5 summers ago. Mion's hands balled into frustrated fists on the table. Matron, she swore. The innkeep finally opened her eyes and caught Yen's gaze. Your mother and I met a while ago, when she brought you to Gridania as a child. We tried to keep in touch, but Mion trailed off. She smiled sadly. I wish she could have been here to see you. With a hoarse and hollow voice, Yen nodded. Me too. Mion leaned forward, placing her hand gently on Yen's shoulder. Welcome, Yennefer, she said, her voice only barely audible over the crowd. Welcome to Gridania.